Where we go.
All right, cool. Well, should be a fun one. Nutrient timing discussion, mostly in the context of muscle hypertrophy, but also a little bit of performance in general. Thought the article was really good. It is 7 years old, so there's some age on it, but I think most of it still holds fairly true right now, and it's not as if the article made any like yeah, 100% cut and dry this is right, this is wrong things, so or statements. So anyways, let's go ahead and get started. What is nutrient timing? What is the traditional argument for it? What is the anabolic window? Let's set the stage here by explaining all that.
Well, it's just either pre or post exercise, like your intake of protein and carbohydrates, in an effort to I guess what they would say is you're taking it at the best time, puts your body in the best position to get the protein in. Your body will absorb it the best. You can for enhanced recovery and protein synthesis and refilling your glycogen stores, taking it at this time is the best time to do it. So and typically what we hear a lot of is like immediately after exercise. That's kind of where it comes from.
Yeah, essentially, I mean, if that's the technical definition presented in the introduction of the article, basically just said the basis of nutrient timing involves the consumption of combination of nutrients, primarily protein and carbs, in and around an exercise session, and it's designed to maximize or sort of like have a super compensation effect on the adaptation, supposedly, if you time it at the right time. So right after, it's sort of the anabolic window is that if you really get a big dose of protein right after the workout, you're going to get a super compensated or basically increased anabolic effect from that workout than if you wait. So for years, the sort of anabolic window idea was sort of something that people just assumed was, very, very important and very, very true. And, the article talks a little bit more about some of the science behind that and nutrient timing in general. Does anyone else have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, I don't know where I first heard this from. I don't know if I read this myself, like in high school or something. But before I started working at AFS, I remember just very much thinking like, when you get done exercising, your muscles are like a sponge. They're ready to, they're like ready to absorb, and that's why you drink your protein shake right after, because those muscles will absorb it right away and start using it. I remember I had like a firm belief in in that window. Like if I didn't drink my protein shake within an hour, like I'm not going to get all the effects I could out of it.
Yeah, well, the study, jumping ahead a second, I mean, the next thing we were going to talk about here is glycogen depletion, and they research does show a increased increased rate of glycogen storage when the carbohydrate is consumed immediately post exercise. They say delaying consumption by just 2 hours can slow down that rate of glycogen resynthesis by as much as 50%. So in some ways, there is some truth to that. Now, how relevant that is questionable. Unless how fast you replenish your glycogen stores really only becomes relevant if you are, an endurance athlete that is going to be doing, 2 training bouts on the same day, or a hardcore meathead lifting twice a day, that sort of thing, or just in a significant calorie deficit. Potentially, that could be beneficial too.
Yeah, Mike, I remember when you used to have those practitioner meetings with us. I remember this was a big section when it was, it was Claire and Emily and Sawyer and Jen and Kemper. We were all sitting in your office once a week. I remember going over this, and I remember, I've held on to that pretty much since that meeting. You talked about how, like, if you're doing like a 2 a day, or if you're someone someone that's going to be working out multiple times in a day, then the nutrient time becomes a lot more important. But then I guess, we'll get into more things, but even regardless of hearing that in the meeting, and of course believing you, because I know that you do all the research and you look at actual facts. I've still continued to always just drink it right after workout and do my thing. And it's more so not because of necessarily the science I used to believe in, but more so, that's just my routine to make sure I get it in.
Well, as we'll discuss, I mean, nothing wrong with doing that, and it's not going to hurt you. It might help you. I mean, I don't think, if anything, this article and some of the videos shared, almost, improved my view of nutrient timing than it did hurt it, like, 'cause I went, I sort of swung really far, like, it doesn't matter, people blow it out of proportion. Well, it could still help. There are, for some people, it could help. It's not going to hurt you. So maybe that might not necessarily be a bad thing, Ty, to time it like that. It's just, I wouldn't, so long as we're not tricking ourselves by thinking that it's like like the most important thing to do.
Yeah.
Well, I also think we have to bear in mind, it's very challenging to truly quantify the magnitude of the response, particularly from a hypertrophic perspective, to something like nutrient timing. This is the $1 million question in all research associated with hypertrophy. Certainly you can quantify cellular signaling mechanisms and upregulation of pathways like mTOR that are involved in the protein synthesis response. But at the end of the day, does that really result in significant accretion of skeletal muscle protein? We know that that's pretty equivocal based upon the research. And beyond that, as they talked about in this article, a lot of the training studies that are done aren't the best because they're not done over a long period of time. They're done with novice subjects, and we know that they're going to respond very differently than the response to a more trained population. But I think that's the biggest challenge, particularly when you talk about hypertrophy. It's very easy to determine muscle glycogen resynthesis. That's just a biopsy that you can do and determine how much glycogen is in the muscle. But just muscle growth and protein synthesis is so difficult to quantify that I think if what you said being true, Sawyer, that it might help you and it's not going to hurt you, then I'm always going to err on the side of doing it, because if it might help me and there's not a lot of training studies done on advanced trainees such as us, then why not use it? Because there's no, other than the calories it's taken away from calories you can have at other meals during the day, there's no real downside to it.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it is generally a good recommendation. I think we just have to be, as we're explaining it to our clients, just be, this is things that we'd all do anyways, obviously setting the expectation that, hey, if you want to drive home and get your meal and it's 20 minutes later, that's probably going to be fine. You don't have to chug that protein shake. It can be from a whole meal. It doesn't necessarily have to be from a protein shake, that sort of thing. And, whether it's 5 minutes after or 25 minutes after, it's probably not a massive difference. The bigger thing is if you're waiting, 2-3 hours. But
well, I think that the one thing that this article talks about, which is relevant to our discussion with our clients, is that much of the research that's done in this article is done on a young, apparently healthy, reasonably fit population that has an outcome goal of improving performance and increasing muscle mass to a significant degree. The population that we work with maybe doesn't have quite as aggressive of a goal, but also they probably don't have as good of a dietary pattern. And I've often wondered if you would see a more pronounced anabolic window or nutrient timing response in a population that was more nutritionally deficient. Let's say if somebody has very, very poor, incomplete protein sources for the vast majority of their day, except possibly at dinner, what's the magnitude of the nutrient timing response for that individual for some BCAAs before exercise or whey protein after exercise? I would suspect, just anecdotally from working with people over the years, that serving of BCAAs or that one scoop of whey protein pre or post exercise respectively, I think it would make a more substantive difference in those individuals than it would in someone who eats a relatively healthy, well-rounded diet.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just as a strategy to improve overall total protein and quality protein as a whole for somebody that's only getting 70 grams of protein a day or something, it becomes a pretty good, easy way to do that.
Yeah, I wonder in that scenario, I agree with Mike that it probably would result in a more robust response. I guess relative to this specific conversation of the anabolic window, my question would be if you add that 30 grams of protein in at any point in the day, what's the difference in the magnitude of the response in that scenario? So if you add 30 grams in that anabolic window versus adding 30 grams, maybe 10 grams to each low protein meal that they have during the day, their 3 meals, which one yields a more robust response in that scenario? So there's so much nuance to it. I think that I'm kind of in Sawyer's, like you guys all know, I was a freaking supplement nut job. I read everything on supplements. I took every supplement. I timed everything. I timed my meals. I did all of it to a T, and then realized through reading more and more research that I kind of swung the same way that Sawyer swung, where I didn't think it mattered at all. And I think I've kind of come back to rest a little bit more in the middle of that continuum, where it probably does help a little bit. And we don't really know because there's no long-term research. So it's probably best just to, if you can afford to do it and it's not a stress to do it, probably worth doing it. But yeah, it's definitely an interesting topic that I think the most and contributes to my bias to be like anti-anabolic window is just, I hate the marketing hype that supplement companies and some nutritionists and people push out there to overemphasize the importance of it. So I try to swing the opposite direction to combat that. But I do think there's probably some credibility to it.
Yeah, for
Jared
sure.
Jared was just happy that he wasn't as genetically inferior as he thought when he was doing all this shit, and he wasn't getting stronger, getting bigger.
Eileen's listening, and she said that you're not being very nice, and you need to think about how you're feeling about yourself.
Tom,
All right,
I do want to bring up something Jared said that I think is important, and they mentioned this in the study or in the article, that with the inability to match protein dosing for some of the research, that was a confounding factor. Meaning, was it that the increase, just the mere increase of total protein in the person's diet, resulting in the positive adaptations versus when it was consumed? Because some of the studies didn't match for protein. But to circle back to what Jared said, which I also think is important, is that I actually think that either way, having it there dietarily spread out throughout the day, or in that so-called nutrient timing or anabolic window, would probably have very similar effects. But I think of it from a practical standpoint in terms of ease of implementation habitually. If you already have a habit that is a workout, and then you're adding another habit to that before or afterwards using habit stacking, the likelihood that you're going to consume that increased amount of protein is greater, particularly if it's just a simple scoop of whey protein. I've always looked at that as a very low barrier to entry in terms of improving your nutritional quality.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I've actually had this conversation with clients in the past when they really need to increase their protein intake, and I'll ask them, is this going to be easier for you to do in one shake at some point where you don't have a meal, or is this easier for you to do when you're at home and you just want to add it to, say, breakfast, like half of a scoop to breakfast and half of a scoop to dinner? And the response is relatively, like, in my experience, has been relatively even. Some people are like, yeah, I'd rather just have it at home. I eat my dinner at home, eat my breakfast at home. It's easier for me to do that instead of carrying a shaker cup with me, mixing up the powder, blah, blah, blah. So I think that Mike's point to stacking habits, which we all know is a very research-backed thing. I think asking clients what habits are going to be easiest to stack is helpful.
Yeah. Well, let's jump into a little bit of the specific. I'm blanking on the word right now. basically let's jump into the glycogen repletion conversation, then muscle protein breakdown and protein synthesis, a little bit of the actual why and some of the science behind like why these things are beneficial. So when we talk about glycogen, why, based on what was presented in the article, in addition to what we already know, why is glycogen repletion important, or also why would having high glycogen storage going into a workout be important?
Well, as we know, we specifically use the glycogen in our muscle to, produce ATP during our workouts. And they mentioned in the article that in like a higher intensity workout, you can deplete close to 80% of your stores. Sorry, there's like a cat and dog fight going on right now. You can deplete, up to 80% of your stores of glycogen during the session. So obviously you want to have as much, Mike's cracking up, as much available energy as possible. I know, this is weird sometimes.
I found those percentages fairly interesting. They said high intensity training, resistance training with a moderate, or no, that was a different one. Actually, there's different studies showing different things. That one showed that even high intensity, moderate, so 6 to 9 sets per muscle group will only deplete glycogen stores by 40%, perhaps. However, if you're doing a Mike stack, 20 sets per muscle group or whatever, something like that, we might be a little more glycogen depleted there.
I think they said 80% of ATP comes from glycogen stores.
Yeah. So,
and the other thing is that there's the depletion, but that's all relative to how much your glycogen stores were filled going in. And that's always an interesting question. And then you start to get to the conversation of, you do a chest, shoulder, and tricep workout, you're using your triceps and your shoulders during chest, how much of the glycogen is being depleted there. I think on balance, I think that section of the article basically was getting to the point of, hey, glycogen is really important for resistance training, and being as full from a glycogen perspective will facilitate performance in workouts to a greater degree than being depleted.
Yeah. And Israel touched on this. I don't know how many people watched the video, but Israel touched on this. I mean, just from I think everybody knows it's been on a calorie deficit before. Working out on a calorie deficit, it feels like crap. And if you can have additional glycogen during the workout, you just feel so much better. So your intensity is higher. Also glycogen increases water in the muscle. So there's intracellular swelling benefit to it. You get a little bit more of a pump, which can, in some research, show that it increases mechanical growth factors because of the stressing of the cellular wall internally. So there's obviously benefits on that end as well.
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, like the main takeaway is sort of, if you're in a calorie deficit, there's probably there's something to be said for either making sure you're getting one of your meals, an hour or two before your workout, or if you're not able to do that, then perhaps supplementing with some dextrose, which is obviously a little bit of a hard pill to swallow if you're also in a calorie deficit, because you don't want your calories to come from dextrose, but that is important to the quality of your workout. If you're somebody whose goal is hypertrophy, not fat loss, and you're in a surplus or balance, you're probably, at least, most of the time you're going to be glycogen full going into a workout, unless you're exercising 4 or 5+ hours from your last meal, at which point, taking some dextrose with some aminos or something pre-workout may be a good idea. But also, again, it's not going to hurt you. So if you want to do it, you could, but that's
if your goal is hypertrophy or strength, even it's always err on the side of caution. Those individuals should be consuming upwards of 500 grams of carbohydrates per day to ensure their glycogen stores are topped off. One thing I will say that I don't think a lot of people consider is that if you exercise earlier in the day, particularly if you're exercising first thing in the morning, your liver glycogen stores are completely depleted overnight. You'll burn through that roughly, 75 to 100 grams of liver glycogen between your last meal of the previous day. and until you get to that 100-gram point the next day. And since your liver glycogen stores are responsible for fueling your central nervous system, I do think it's critical that people who are training for strength or hypertrophy and doing workouts early in the day, some way, somehow, if they can, figure out a way to, if they can't get to that 100-gram of carbohydrate number pre-exercise, then they're actually consuming sugar during exercise to make up for what would normally be circulating in the bloodstream and providing fuel to the central nervous system. Yeah. Central fatigue is a very real factor in strength and hypertrophy type of workouts, just as it would be in endurance workouts.
Yeah, it's funny you bring that up, because like when I switched to working out at like 5 a.m., I noticed immediately like I just felt like garbage when I was lifting heavy in my first few sets. So I started packing my bag with like an apple or like gummy bears or something that was like really easy to eat. Because I'm going to stay in bed as long as I can at that early in the morning, so I don't want to eat a full meal right before I go in. But it's just crazy the difference that I've seen with working out at 5 a.m. as opposed to like 2 p.m. with just strength in general.
Well, that's an aside there, Adam. This is not a circadian rhythm conversation, but we know that as your circadian rhythm for body core temperature rises throughout the course of the day, and as core temperature goes up, we know that strength and power performance improves. So you kind of get that double whammy first thing in the morning of low glycogen stores / nutrient status, as well as your circadian rhythm favoring a state where it's actually lower performance from a strength and power standpoint. What's interesting is if you look at the Olympic records for speed, strength, and power events, almost all of them are set in the mid to late afternoon and into the evening, and endurance records are set at the other time during the day. They're set in the morning when body core temperature is lower, which would tend to facilitate endurance performance a little bit more.
Wow.
Interesting stuff. All right, well, let's summarize glycogen really fast before we move on to muscle protein breakdown. So, like going into your workout, glycogen full is important because most of our energy from training comes from our glycogen stores. If you're in a calorie deficit, this is probably even more important. Post exercise, we didn't really talk about this too much, but expeditiously fueling the muscle glycogen stores post workout, probably not super important unless you're going to be doing another workout later in the day. So whether you replenish the glycogen stores in the first hour or a couple hours later, probably not going to make a massive difference. Moving on to protein breakdown. This is another benefit that people tout of nutrient timing. And a lot of this cycles around the idea of spiking insulin after your workout, and that basically being, leading to having an anabolic effect. Does anyone want to speak to this a little bit? I know, Mike, this is something I've heard you talk about quite a bit. What do you want to give us a quick overview of why in theory spiking insulin would be beneficial, and maybe a little bit of what the research is showing on this?
Yeah, well, first, exercise puts you in an insulin sensitized state in the first place. And you're already going to be, post-exercise because of the need to store nutrients. You're already upregulating GLUT4 transporters and a whole host of other signaling mechanisms to drive nutrients into the cell. And then the thought is you consume a whey protein after exercise, which is an insulin potentiator. We know that whey protein causes insulin release, as would additional carbohydrates, and that enhanced insulin sensitivity, increased upregulation with GLUT4 transporters, combined with the presence of those nutrients, in theory, should be driving more amino acid into the cell, which should be able to stop the catabolic process and start the anabolic process. In general, that is the theory, and I think, as the article points out, this is kind of equivocal and kind of complicated, particularly given the period of time that muscle protein synthesis actually takes place over. It's not this acute, discrete event that happens in the hour after exercise. It's actually an event that predominantly happens in the hours to days after an exercise bout, and that's where this starts to become a little bit more complicated.
Yeah, that's something I found interesting. They said the muscle protein breakdown is going to happen in response to workout. That's actually part necessary to then rebuild. But we don't, we do want to sort of reduce the level of breakdown as much as possible. However, I found it interesting that it was only slight muscle protein breakdowns, only slightly elevated post-workout, and it's actually sort of like it reaches its like highest level, at least according to this article that they referenced, at about 195 minutes following the workout.
Yeah, so it's not, I think that the way this has been touted is that protein post-exercise acts as a master switch to turn off degradation in skeletal muscle. And while probably to some degree that's happening, that's a great oversimplification for a very, very complicated mechanistic set of events.
Yeah. And then this one section of the article that, make sure I'm interpreting this correctly, but they basically say, so it basically says, so that while the theoretical basis behind spiking insulin post-workout is inherently sound, it remains questionable as whether its benefit extend into practice. First and foremost, research has consistently shown that in the presence of elevated plasma amino acids, the effect of insulin elevation on net muscle protein balance plateaus within a range of 15 to 30 microliters, roughly 3 to 4 times normal fasting levels. This insulinogenic effect is easily accomplished with typical mixed meals. So basically, insulin is only going to have, if I'm interpreting this correctly, so much of an effect, and then it sort of maxes out. And that effect is easily achieved just with a normal mixed meal. You don't have to do something crazy like ingest 70 grams of protein post-workout to get that effect. So it can have a benefit. It's something to keep in mind, but it's not something that necessarily involves like a crazy intervention to achieve. They sort of wrap this section up by basically saying that, the recommendation for lifters to spike insulin post-exercise is somewhat trivial for most people, but it can be important in the absence of basically, a good pre-exercise meal. So.
Yeah, I think that's part of the point of the whole digestion and absorption process, is particularly if it's a full mixed meal consumed a couple hours before training, that's going through a terminal digestion and absorption, as you're doing your workout, when you're stopping your workout, in that period of time after the workout. It's not like if you train at 11 a.m. and you have breakfast at 7 a.m., a lot of the nutrients from that breakfast are going to be released into the bloodstream in your just natural post-exercise window because of the length of time for digestion and absorption.
Yeah, for sure. And I thought one last thing from me here, at least on this before we move into protein synthesis, is that it sounds like the importance of limiting muscle protein breakdown is perhaps a little bit overstated. They said that like the anabolic response of nutrient timing is mostly due to an increase in muscle protein synthesis, not so much in reducing any breakdown that's occurring. So sort of splitting hairs there on the exact, like, why is it important? It is important, just the why behind it.
Well, and if you think about it too, sir, and this is what I've often thought with the overemphasis on reducing catabolism post-exercise, is that what's causing that protein breakdown is the mechanical stress associated with the exercise bout. As soon as that goes away, much of that's going to stop. It's not like your muscle just continues to break down spontaneously after training because you initiated a bout of training. It's going to stop pretty much when exercise stops at that point. So really, how much could a nutritional intervention counteract something that's likely mostly going to stop anyway? because you stopped doing the thing that was breaking it down in the first place.
Yeah, for sure. All right, well, on that, so we covered glycogen. So one of the benefits of nutrient timing is glycogen repletion. Another one is limiting protein breakdown, although perhaps, so glycogen repletion important, going into a workout full on glycogen is important. Limiting muscle breakdown or protein breakdown, maybe less of something to worry about. Protein synthesis is the next thing mentioned in the article. They mentioned this is maybe the most touted benefit of post-workout nutrition is to really maximize and spike that muscle protein synthetic process in the body. Who wants to talk a little bit more about muscle protein synthesis? Is this something that is supported by the, by timing your nutrition, your nutrient timing right after a workout? And also what are some limitations, which Mike talked about a little bit with regards to muscle protein synthesis in general?
So basically, going off of what Mike said around the anabolic window and the insulin concept, to tie in with that, you're going to have, if you take in a protein source, typically that's rich in leucine or BCAAs, the muscle protein synthesis, all that really means is the claim is that nutrient timing is going to enhance muscle protein synthesis due to the state of the muscle and just the person's body after training. And that's driven through those three particular amino acids, particularly leucine. If you have enough leucine in that meal, that is going to stimulate muscle protein synthesis, which will, quote unquote, build more muscle or help the muscle rebuild quicker, more efficiently, what have you. The issue, I think, was already stated here, is does that actually lend itself to increase in skeletal muscle mass after the fact? So does higher protein synthesis correlate directly with increase in skeletal muscle mass? We still don't know that yet.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that normal meals outside of nutrient timing, granted it's high in particularly leucine content, to maybe 3 grams of leucine content in a meal, will do the same thing. It'll stimulate the same type of response. Granted, those meals aren't too close together as having it immediately post-workout.
Yeah. So, essentially, muscle protein synthesis can be measured in the body and is used to sort of try to quantify, and if muscle protein synthesis is elevated to various rates, the assumption is that you're going to build more muscle and it's going to lead to hypertrophy. However, that is an indirect measure. It's not exactly clear how much those two things are 100% correlated with one another. So that is a limitation. And then what is the research? So what does the research show, at least, or what do they, from this article, about it is ingesting protein immediately after exercise correlated with a higher increase in muscle protein synthesis compared with waiting a little bit of time.
Basically, they said in the article, there's just not enough support in either direction. There's some studies that show that, yes, that would be the case, that looks like the case, and some that showed no significance. So it's just kind of, again, one of the things where it's probably not going to hurt you. It's probably going to benefit you for your total protein intake if it's easy to get it in right after, but there's not enough clear support saying that immediately post that it spikes muscle protein synthesis.
Yeah, pretty much. The unsexy answer is that not enough data to know for sure. So
the one article by Levenhagen was interesting because it's comparing the two groups, the group that had the protein right after and the group that had it 3 hours after. It was like a threefold increase for the people right after, and then only 12% for the group that consumed it 3 hours after. But again, they said other studies showed no significance, so can't say for sure.
Yeah, I didn't dive too deep into that, but that's a pretty massive,
huge difference in that one.
Well, and then you start to also consider the differences in study protocol. What was the training protocol? What were the populations of subjects that were trained? there's so much nuance to what determines a given outcome or a result from a study. And although these review articles are great and they're helpful, sometimes it doesn't allow you to truly compare apples to apples when you're looking at two different research studies in the same domain.
They also said that study they did aerobic exercise, not even resistance training. So it might be a little hard to translate that over to resistance training. They also, I mean, this is beyond the scope of what we're talking about, but the fractional synthetic rate could be, so like what they're measuring could be due to an increase in like protein synthesis of the mitochondria and not even like the muscle fibers themselves. So that would make sense with aerobic exercise.
And overarching for this is what we talked about when we first started, which is, does MPS actually equal hypertrophy? And that is still a controversial topic. Does one actually correlate with the other? Just because mTOR is upregulated, does that mean you're going to see significant protein synthesis? And I think that the jury is still out on that, probably leaning towards those two aren't as tightly correlated as what we once thought.
Yeah. All right. And does anyone else? Well, one other thing on the muscle protein synthesis thing, and I think this was touched on a little bit by Israel in his video, if you watched it, was just there is something to be said for, this is more with overall meal frequency. If you're constantly just spiking your muscle protein synthesis slightly by like a ton of meals over the course of the day, you might actually not be, versus having like a higher, maybe slightly fewer, higher doses of protein, you're not going to get the same muscle protein synthesis reaction if you're eating 7 meals with 20 grams of protein per day versus 4 with 50, that sort of thing. So as it relates to exercise, if you had a pre-exercise meal and out 2 hours before your workout, and then your workout was an hour long and it's been just 3 hours since you ate last, it might be less important for you to eat another meal. Your MPS is probably already elevated pretty high from both the workout and that pre-exercise meal, versus, again, if you ate 3 hours before your workout and now it's 5 hours since your last meal. So to take it within the context of everything going on with your meal timing.
Yeah, that's the fascinating refractory response conversation as to how low does that pool of free amino acids need to go to maximize subsequent protein synthesis, and what is the refractory period. We do know that protein synthesis is a relatively energy dependent process, and consumption of probably upwards of 40 grams of protein at a time is likely optimal for maximizing muscle protein synthesis. You probably need 30 grams to actually maximize amino acid availability, and the other 10 grams are just going to be used for the energetic process of actually synthesizing protein. I think sometimes, and this was mentioned maybe in the hypertrophy section, where they talked about the dosing potentially being inadequate, like the one study that they talked about that Bailey just mentioned, their dosing was 10 grams of protein, 8 grams of carbs, and 3 grams of fat. I would say that's a relatively inadequate dose of protein to sufficiently spike muscle protein synthesis, just because of that 10 grams of protein can easily go to just the energetic requirements of synthesizing protein.
Yeah, and also some of those, like you can make a claim of MPS was spiked 3 times over baseline, which sounds like super intriguing, but that might not actually mean that much. 10 grams of protein could have a small increase in MPS that is 3 times over baseline, but is still 20 times less than what you could maximally stimulate, so the words people use sometimes in these articles can sound really important when maybe it's not quite that impactful.
Well, there's always the difference between statistically significant and practically relevant. And ultimately, we care a lot more about practical relevance than we do statistical significance.
All right, let's jump into the muscle hypertrophy section, because ultimately this is, everything we've talked about to this point has sort of been with the end goal of increased hypertrophy, unless we're talking about performance, which is important, but not as much what we've been talking about today. They they basically talked about a number of studies here. There was a table. I don't know if you guys looked at that table of about 7 studies that looked at impact on hypertrophy of nutrient timing. What are your guys' takeaways, or what did you find interesting based on what they presented there?
It started off saying that it's kind of hard to tell from a lot of these research that is done, because a majority of the research does both pre and like post, protein intake, whereas so it's hard to like, get a good reading of strictly what post, post exercise consumption leads to. But I mean, the first experiment that they brings up the fact that, they had one group right after their exercise, supplement right away. And then they had the other group, after a 2-hour period, take it in. And in that experiment, the people that had the protein right after, or right after the workout had bigger gains in muscle mass and strength. And then the very next experiment that they bring up, did something similar. They had one actually take a real protein supplement, one group take a placebo, and the end results were that they had similar results. So right there, you got one experiment saying one thing, another experiment saying another thing. Now for that second experiment, they say that was strictly training lower body, and it's hard to know from that experiment, is there a difference between if we did this experiment on someone's lower body versus someone's upper body? But kind of like a non-sexy answer again, because you have experiments kind of, showing results for in 2 different directions. So,
yeah.
So yeah, we don't necessarily really know.
Well, the first thing that jumped out to me, and Ty, you're absolutely right, is you look at the sheet and you're like, how can you possibly compare these studies with each other? First off, you look down the column for measurement instrument and you see everyone's using different methods to determine the hypertrophic response. You just compare like the first 3 studies on there. You've got a 10 gram of a milk soy combination. The next study, you've got 40 grams of whey isolate, 43 grams of glucose, and 7 grams of creatine. And then the next study, you have 20 grams of protein or 20 grams of dextrose, which if you're the placebo there, I think you have to know you're getting the placebo, because it's going to taste very different. It's hard to compare.
Also, there's 13 untrained elderly males in the first one, and then 23 young recreational male bodybuilders in the second one. That's what I laughed at.
Well, and as an aside, the guy, Darren Willoughby there, that third study, I actually know this dude pretty well from my time at the Arnold, and DW is legit. This guy's a freak. That's Darren right there.
Okay. All right, yeah.
This motherfucker talks and talks and talks. I've never heard, like, you guys think I talk a lot?
Where's his neck?
Like, that dude is just a ball of talking. Nicest guy in the world, but will talk forever.
Yeah, I mean, looking at these studies as a whole, so there were 7 of them. 4 of them found a benefit to nutrient timing on muscle hypertrophy. 3 did not. However, looking at out of the 7, only 3 were protein matched. So, I mean, in my opinion, if it's not protein matched, you might as well throw it out the window. The measurement tools were all over the place. All of the subjects were untrained. There are a number of other limitations to the research. A lot of these did pre and post supplementation, as opposed to, maybe just post if we're really trying to measure the anabolic window. Most of them, again, were untrained individuals. The method used to assess hypertrophy was all over the place. So, it's really despite this being such like a hot topic and something people talk about a lot, the research is really not very strong, one to really say one way or another that yes, this is super important, or no, it isn't.
I find it interesting that they mentioned in here anabolic resistance in the elderly. And I think that is actually an important point to touch on really briefly, with the thought being that there's just a lower level anabolic response to amino acid ingestion and training as you age, which probably favors the increased consumption of protein as somebody ages to get the same muscle protein synthesis response as a lower dose when someone is younger. And I think that's further confounded by the fact that as we age, we know that our taste buds tend to not be quite as effective, and we tend to move towards more hyper palatable foods as we age and away from protein. So that kind of, I think it does speak to the importance for our aging population that we do ensure that they consume enough protein. One, because they're just resistant to the standard anabolic effects of a typical dose of protein. And two, the changes in their taste buds and their palate are going to drive them away from consuming something that's a little more bland like protein, and probably something more towards something that's more highly palatable.
Yeah, that's an interesting sort of conundrum there. And this came out, again, this article came out in 2013. And I know, I mean, I just scrolling through my Twitter timeline in the last few years, that I know there's been more research done on anabolic resistance in the elderly or just older population in general. And that is, there's a lot of evidence to support that theory, but it's hard because the individuals that are maybe, that need, 2 grams of protein per pound or something like that, perhaps, 1.5 are going to be the people that are probably the hardest to actually, good luck getting 75-year-old Susie to ingest 150 grams of protein in a day, on a consistent basis. So
yeah, Bob Pop's not gonna slam down a bunch of whey protein.
Dang.
Well, what I think is interesting though with anabolic resistance, and I know this isn't the topic, but I often wonder if that's a chicken or the egg situation. Whereas they're breaking down more protein as they age. You're getting more necrosis of the type 2B motor nerves. That whole process is happening. You're not training. You're getting general sarcopenia. Is part of that whole sarcopenic process driving the anabolic resistance, or is it some other biological factor associated with aging? I've always wondered that. But
yeah, that might be an interesting one to dive into, one of these.
Yeah, it actually would mechanistically, maybe what's driving anabolic resistance in the aging and Jared.
Well, you mentioned earlier too that MPS is energy dependent. So I do wonder if these are the research that they've done, if they're ensuring, I imagine they're probably ensuring that the individuals are eating enough. So I would venture to guess that the older population is more likely to undereat. The appetites decrease and probably not meet their energy needs. So that could also be, if you're getting the same, even if it's protein matched, but it's not energy matched, you can't really compare the two. Now we're having a conversation in chat between Mike and Jared over who's bigger. So totally devolved into meathead debauchery.
Not to be repeated, given the fact we're recording.
All right. So anything else on the hypertrophy conversation before we start to sort of wrap up and talk about general practical takeaways? One last thing that I thought was important, they talk about this a little bit, is training status. Basically all the research is done on, not all of it, but the majority, a lot of it's been done on untrained individuals. And I think untrained individuals, nutrient timing is probably the least important. That's the population that this is least important to. If you're untrained, you could do almost anything and see hypertrophy. Even aerobic exercise, it might result in some hypertrophy. So it'd be interesting to get more research done, and maybe there is some more that we could find. Again, this article was published 7 years ago on looking just at trained individuals. But they did mention, Bird et al. Reported that an acute bout of resistance training in untrained subjects stimulates both mitochondrial and myofibrillar protein synthesis, whereas in trained subjects, protein synthesis is more preferential towards the myofibrillar component. this suggests a less global response in advanced trainees that might warrant closer attention to timing, nutrient timing. So I found that section interesting. All right, what are our general takeaways? You know, what recommendations are we making to people and why?
Well, I guess, you know, we said really early in this, you know, for the people this matters probably most for is not a lot of people that we're probably working with a whole bunch in terms of people I train them multiple times in a day, or like an endurance person that's got like a hard bout of competition, you know, a little bit of a break and then they got to go again. You know, it's going to be really important for someone like that, which we're not necessarily like that. And a lot of our clients aren't necessarily like that. You know, we talk about like your totally daily intake. That's probably like the more important thing to focus on. You know, how are you eating throughout the day, to make sure you're getting in enough protein and getting in those carbs to make sure, you know, you're replenishing and you're full. But you know, the research can be conflicting at times, but there is some research out there that there are some benefits from it. So with Mike talking about like habit stacking and Jared talking about like ease of implementation and stuff, I mean, if people have the time, if it's not causing too much stress and it works kind of for your routine to get it in right after the workout, then go for it. There may be some slight benefits to it. Don't get super hung up on if you're not able to do that, you know, consistently every time, or if it doesn't work for your schedule, because there's a lot of research that shows that it's not necessarily like, you know, like the absolute most important thing either. So, I guess, we talked a little bit about if you're going to exercise, make sure those glycogen stores are full. So, you know, having some carbohydrate before working out can certainly be something that we say is I guess having a brain fart on the wording, but something that people can definitely implement, even people we work with. You know, for my schedule, it works really well for me to make sure I get my protein in right after my workout, just because it's a habit that I've formed that works for me to make sure I get it in. So, I know that was like a long answer, but
Good time.
that's where I'm at. Right?
Yeah, you basically summarized anything I would say. Agree with all that.
Yeah, our current clients, I've leaned more towards talking about nutrient timing as just a way to improve overall diet. It's easy, it makes sense to them. They can like grasp it pretty. It's like something tangible. And so most of our clients, the only thing I would say, I guess that's it could be beneficial to our clients in the sense that most of them are probably protein deficient compared to all of us. So in that sense, having a 1 or 2 bolus times a day where they can take in 30 grams of protein that's relatively easy to grasp is basically how I would center my conversations around nutrient timing.
Yeah, I mean, you guys pretty much covered everything that I would say. I think as a strategy in to moderately trained individual, as a strategy just to ensure overall protein intake and overall nutrition, it's a good, often easy, low barrier of entry way to do it. For people that are more trained, and then it's one of those things where you know, the little things might start to make a bigger difference for those people, and for that person it might even become something you would become even more concerned about. That being said, it's not one of those things where if the idea to a client of for whatever reason, if nutrient timing is not a good, doesn't work great for them, you don't need to scare them or stress them out over out. Well, guess you're screwed. You know, it's not how it works. So.
Yeah, definitely stay away from telling people they wasted their workout if they don't get their protein in right after.
Yeah. All right. Anything else? We got 2 minutes. Anybody? Anything else, or should we sign off here? All right. Awesome.
That was good.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Appreciate it.
Bye.
Thanks, guys. Have a good day.